Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about professionalism, a very important topic if you want to succeed in any law job. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Career Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Career Site. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about a very important topic, which is how to behave like a professional in the legal workplace. Now, you might be thinking this is kind of obvious, but the reality is that many law students haven't worked in a similar environment before getting their first legal jobs. Either they've got limited work experience in general, or the experience is much more casual than a law firm or a government law job. The legal world is actually pretty formal, even in California, and it's important to understand the expectations so you can avoid faux pas that make it seem like you don't belong.
Absolutely. And first off, let's talk a little bit about our prior experience, because I know, Lee, you had really worked in a similar environment, but I hadn't had much experience in a professional type of environment. So tell me about what you did before law school.
So for about a year outside of my undergraduate, I worked in political public relations, which basically meant that I worked near government agencies and we worked with small governments in Sacramento. And Sacramento is actually quite a formal environment. Everybody wears suits to work at the Capitol and things like that. So that was my first introduction to kind of a more formal environment. And then after that, I worked as a high-tech consultant where I did a lot of client-facing work. And although my client's office wasn't necessarily very formal, I worked in a lot of government agency offices. There was still a lot of formality because they were paying us a lot of money to be their consultants. And so they expected a certain amount of professionalism, even though most of us were quite young. I mean, management was older, but most of us were 22, 23 that were working at these client sites.
Yeah, that's interesting because I worked as a programmer before I went to law school where the clients were also paying a lot of money per hour, like lawyer rates basically, for me to work on their projects. But the idea that I would, wear a suit to a meeting with them would just be laughable. I mean, I would never, if a programmer showed up in a suit, it would be like, whoa.
That is true, which is probably why the programmers stayed back at the client or at the site where they were actually building the programs that we were implementing. But
yeah, it's just interesting because it's like, the tech environment has the whole culture and the sort of the perception of it is so focused on this idea of not being a formal sort of professional environment. It's actually very interesting when, as a lawyer, you have high-tech clients because you have to walk a very fine line. If you're going to, say, go to Yahoo and pitch for new business, the lawyers can't show up in a bunch of suits because then they look like the suits, but they also can't dress like programmers. So, it was interesting because I would go on these pitches to high tech companies and, an email would go out the night before saying, do not wear a suit. Mm-hmm. This is the dress code. Don't wear jeans. Although I have seen the managing partner to go to a pitch in jeans at a tech company. That's rare. But, it is... I guess the point is all workplaces have sort of their own environment, and part of the goal as a young employee is to figure out, what the norms are. Right. And then to the extent that you feel comfortable with that to, basically comply with those norms. This is something we can talk about in a minute, this sort of, what values are we imposing on people here? But I guess for me, the only real experience I'd had in sort of a more professional environment was before I went to architecture school, actually. Right out of college, I worked as a temp in LA in various office environments. Like I worked at Nestle's corporate headquarters for a while. And I remember going to Ann Taylor and buying this suit and like having a briefcase. And I thought it was so cool. Like I would march across this lobby every day with my like click clack heels, my briefcase and my suit. I was like 22 or something, 21. And I loved it. I was like, man, this is so cool. Like I felt like I was playing a role. But it was really fun. It was like I get to like dress up and pretend to be a grown up.
Yeah. It is totally fascinating. I mean, at one point I was an intern at a production company in Hollywood at Universal Studios in college, and that is a completely different work environment. I think one of the things I have learned from all of the different places I have worked is that you really have to be aware of, how everyone's acting around you. And, you might come with your own ideas of what professionalism means, what it means to be part of a corporate culture or an office culture, but you also need to be very observant and take cues from other folks, especially about things like, dress or even email formality or things like that, because, that's almost how you're going to learn what is really the best thing to do in that given environment.
Yeah, and work hours and expectations as well. If everyone's showing up at 10 a.m. and you're there at 8, but you're leaving early, like that might not be the best thing for your career.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, like you don't get credit for those 2 hours you were in the office when no one else was. So, let's unpack this a little bit. What does it mean to be a professional anyway? Is this just some way to impose like snooty upper class values on everyone? Or is there something here that's actually valuable?
I think this is a really loaded question that's probably maybe its own podcast topic.
Good point.
To start kind of unpacking this, to me, in the law especially, I think professionalism means something special because you are representing someone else. You are providing a client service, but it's not even just a client service. Maybe like when you were programming something for somebody else, you are often standing in someone else's shoes and guiding them and making decisions and recommendations for them. Sometimes they're companies, sometimes they're individuals, or maybe they're even government agencies. But
you might literally stand up in court and represent them.
Exactly. And so when you are really playing that role, to me, I think you owe those folks that you're standing up for this duty of professionalism, because you're taking the responsibility of someone else's sometimes life, sometimes money, their freedom, their kids, or even a company's well-being into your hands. And I think that requires a lot of professionalism. If I get very sappy about the importance of lawyers, it's that, we have the power to, guide people through the twists and turns in life that they might not have the knowledge or the ability to guide themselves, or it's impractical for them to guide themselves. And that's very important. So I think professionalism is a big part of that.
No, I agree. I think, as you said, we could have a whole conversation about, particularly the norms in certain legal organizations and things, and people who don't necessarily fit those norms and, that kind of thing. But that's probably a different topic. But I do agree with you that, I think people, if you take seriously the idea of being a lawyer, and you're representing, as you said, a client, but, oftentimes you're an officer of the court, you've sworn to uphold certain things. And I think if you take that seriously, you can talk about things like client service, taking responsibility, really owning your decisions and your work, which means you've got to consistently do really your best work. You can't just dial it in and decide that someone else is going to deal with it. Like oftentimes, even as a young lawyer, like you're actually the last sort of person to touch something, like you might even, hopefully not as a summer associate, but
you're not licensed.
I do have a story where I got a call as a first year summer associate after my first year of law school from an older associate who was getting ready to file something, and he says, "How sure are you that this is right?" And I said, "Well, probably not that sure given I've had 1 year of law school." Why? He says, "Because I don't really have time to review it and we have to file it." And there's this moment of like, holy shit. In the end, he did not actually file it without looking at it, because I was like, no, I really think this is actually your responsibility. But, and I think also you've got to look at being a decent coworker. Are you someone who's easy to work with? Or are you that person who's just causing all kinds of drama in the office and making everyone's lives miserable? That's not really, a way to be a professional. Like, you've got to think of your coworkers as your colleagues. They're your team. And I think, making an effort to be a reasonable person to work with is always a good option.
I think we talked about this in our authenticity podcast from a while ago, but I think it can be a struggle for some folks to really feel like they know what it means for themselves to be a professional. What is the professional version of yourself? Alison and I have been working together for a long time. We've become really good friends. We talk about way more stuff than work. But our relationship is much broader than just our professional relationship. If you meet me out for coffee to talk about business, what I share about my life, what I talk about, how I represent my business and things like that, it might be slightly different. That doesn't mean that it's inauthentic, that's still not me, or you're not getting the true version of me, but that's my professional self. And so one of the things I think, if you're still in law school and you're listening to this, to start kind of slow burning for yourself is, what is this professional version of yourself going to look like, taking into consideration all of these things that are important about professionalism?
No, and I think that's a great point. I think it can be very hard, particularly if you're younger in the workplace, or, a woman or a minority or whatever, to kind of feel like, do you have to fit this sort of dominant paradigm role? And I think one of the things that is interesting is, people can sort of figure out like, okay, these are the pieces that I'm willing to sort of, this is a version of myself that I'm willing to put out there, and it feels authentic to me, even if maybe it's not the exact same person I would be when I'm hanging out with like my best friend from college.
Right, exactly.
Like we all contain multitudes. I might not have gone into a law firm interview and decided to start talking about my Burning Man camp. It's not to say that like I would hide that necessarily if it came up, but I'm not going to bring it up either. And I think, this element of judgment is also an aspect of the legal profession. Do you want to be that person in the organization who's getting completely hammered at like every event? Maybe not.
So it's just something to continue to think about, because I think that journey to find comfort with your professional self, it's not like an overnight thing. I think it's something that you kind of work on, especially by going to networking events and getting to know more people and participate in professional outings or meetings and things like that. And it starts to feel authentic once you can kind of see where you fit. But it can take a while.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes people sort of feel, just like I did in my first like professional job, like I felt like I was dressing up and pretending to be this grown up, which kind of I was. Like I didn't know what I was doing.
And I think the other thing that's been interesting, I felt this way since becoming a mom, and I've had other professional mamas say the same thing to me, is you almost, as your life changes and you as yourself, your true authentic self, goes through some critical life changes, that may influence your professional self. I had a
Right, it's not a static thing.
I had a mama friend tell me at a mama meetup, she was actually a landscape designer, that she had gone to her first it was like a show or some large meeting of landscape designers since she had her baby, and she left her baby at home. And she said, I felt like a fraud. Like nobody knew that I had gone through this crazy thing that had totally uprooted my life. And I was just wandering around like I was the same person that I totally wasn't. Right. And, it was just interesting to me because I hadn't thought that, these milestones in our lives, it could be, like something like having a child or a change in your family situation or a loss in your life. It can be a struggle. You have to kind of reevaluate what is authentic to you. And so it's an ongoing journey. And I think you kind of have to look at it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the fun part here. Like, what are some places that law students and new lawyers really tend to go wrong in this one? I'm just going to go with the first one that really, I think the millennial generation particularly gets a bad rap on this, but I think there is a lot of truth to it, having worked with a number of these people in law firms and in other sort of legal environments, and it's a sense of entitlement. I think for people who have not had a lot of work experience, but they've always been rewarded throughout their lives, like, oh, you're so brilliant, you're so good at this, you're so great at school, blah, blah, blah. It's easy to walk into a legal work environment and think like, man, I am totally badass. I have so much to offer. And like, these people are lucky to have me here. Let me tell you, that is not going to go down very well.
No, because it's likely your secretary knows more about practicing law than you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your secretary might have been there 25 years. Like, they know how to file things. You've never even been to court. So, if you start coming in and like bossing around your secretary, and telling them like, how you want something filed for blah, blah, blah. And they're like, you realize there's electronic filing that's required. And you're like, yeah, but like, I don't want to do that. And they're like, oh, okay. So, I mean, the reality is, as a young lawyer, basically your job is really to make the people above you look good and to make their lives easier. And, I had the managing partner of the firm I was working at tell me this. And I was like, God, like what an ass. He's basically like, you do not understand your job. Your job is to make sure I do not look like an idiot and that I look good. And I was like, wow, that is so obnoxious, but it's true.
It is true. And, I think I was lucky that I had a temp job once where I was filling in as somebody's assistant. And she was a recruiter for a large healthcare company out here on the West Coast. And like high level executive recruiting, not like recruiting for all jobs. And one of my jobs was to put together these files. So when she talked to people, she had everything, in the order in which she needed it, et cetera, et cetera. And I screwed something up. And she, instead of yelling at me, like sat me down, which was actually, I don't even remember her name because I didn't work there very long. But she sat me down and said, I know you're young, but I need to tell you why this small mistake made a big difference into how I conducted myself in this interview. And it put me at risk of not looking good, not looking making this organization look good. And it was a really kind of important moment for me, fresh out of college, to realize that attention to detail of something that you might be rolling your eyes at, like putting together a file folder for a recruiter, actually could have a really big impact. And, even though your role might change, that role of putting things together for somebody else really is something that happens for a long time in your career. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're like working on depositions, somebody's going to put these deposition binders together that basically are like dossiers on the people that you're talking about, whether it's your client, it's a representative, or the person you're interviewing or whatever. Like somebody is going to sit down and like pull every single document that this person has been mentioned in that you've produced and these kind of things. And you might be like, God, this is so beneath me. Like I went to an Ivy League law school and I'm getting paid to like collate. But that's the reality of what you're getting paid for. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like you need to know how to make the copies. You need to know how to operate the fax machine at 2 a.m. when no one else is there to help you. And I think it could be easy to be lulled into kind of this false sense of like someone else will take care of it. But there's going to come a time where like there's nobody else there. And this has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's like you're the one on the line.
So Alison, I think this is an interesting point, because something I was thinking about when you were just saying this is, how does this relate to women getting pigeonholed into doing some of these jobs? Because I know that we've read all these articles that there will be a bunch of men and women in the room and they tell the woman to make copies. So do women, should women say like, I will not make copies? Or do you just have to be, aware that there is a time and a place for that? And there's a time when it doesn't matter who is making the copies just need to get done. Like, how do you think that you kind of feel your way through that?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think it's a really hard thing to balance. I think it's one of those things. I think there is a danger. I mean, the joke at like the firm I worked at was the worst thing that you could be called in a victory email, which they sent out like thanking everyone on the team for like their victory, was to be called hardworking. Because basically it meant that you were doing all the grunt work that no one else wanted to do. And inevitably, usually that was a woman who was like, and thanks for her hard work. It's sort of condescending. It basically means they're taking care of the crap detail. They're doing the office housework.
Right.
Is basically the way that people put it. I think it's a hard line. I think you have to pay attention. And if you start to notice that, there are 2 or 3 people at your level on the same team, and you're the one who's always being asked to take notes, or you're the one who's always being asked to make copies, or to do like the sort of house, to like make sure this and that's happening. I think it's totally fair at some point to either go to a person above you or even in a meeting to say, hey, like basically it's John's turn to take notes this time.
Right.
Like I think it's okay to call it out. I think you just have to be, and I think you should call it out. And if, if that involves going to a partner that you're working for and you say, I've noticed that this is a situation that's happening, and this is why I'm concerned about it. You know, I want to be a productive member of the team, but I also think we should spread this around. I think that's a fair point to make.
Yeah. I think the key is, though, if you're going to have those hard discussions, which should be had if they are necessary, you still need to come at them with professionalism and respect for those above you and below you and your peers. Because if you conduct yourself in that way, then you have a higher likelihood of success from those meetings than if you kind of go in, you know, circling back to Alison's first point of like this idea of entitlement. You know, it's not that you are not willing to take notes, it's that you have noticed a pattern about who's taking notes. Those are two
right,
very
and you don't think
things.
and you don't think that's productive for the team, and here's why.
Right.
Like, you know, there's a difference between just randomly complaining about something and making a proposal that's actually arguably, you know, to everyone's benefit. You know, I had a situation where I was being made to do this like horrible document review from this like jerk of a lawyer in a completely different office who just basically had a list of people, and he was like, "You're on my list. I get 20 hours of your time this week." And, you know, I was like, I basically went to the partner who I worked for and was like, this is not a productive use of my time. Like, here are the other things I could be doing instead that I cannot be writing like this motion for summary judgment because I am doing 20 hours a week of document review. Do you really think this is the best use of my time? And she was like, no, this is not a good use of your time.
Yeah.
You know, because the point was I was being like, I can make your life easier if you get me off of this ridiculous thing that like is completely fungible and like any warm body could be doing.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, you know, that is like sometimes as a professional, you have to have those hard conversations. You can't just shy away from them. But, you know, you have to think about it strategically and think about like, how am I making my boss's life easier?
For sure. And then there's always the issues of how we dress. Another probably topic we could do podcast after podcast after podcast on. You know, we're not saying that you need to go out and blow a whole bunch of money on a brand new professional wardrobe. That's not really the issue. It's about, again, thinking about how you're presenting yourself and trying to, from my perspective, it's really trying to, you know, present yourself in the way that your peers that you respect are presenting themselves. And the idea that you never want to be either way more formally dressed than everyone around you or way more casually dressed than everyone around you.
Yeah, I mean, basically you don't want your dress to be a distraction. I mean, whatever that means in the environment that you're working in. You know, if you're working at Cravath, that means basically you're going to wear a suit every day because that's what they expect. And if you don't do that, you're a distraction.
Right.
You know, in San Francisco, if you wore a suit every day, you'd be like that freak who always wears a suit.
Unless you work in government, and then that's the cruel joke, because most of my government friends, attorneys, they do have to wear suits every day, and they say that's incredibly unfair, as they can practice law in Sacramento or San Francisco, and they still have to wear suits every day.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, the point is, like, suck it up, you're a lawyer.
Right. Exactly.
Like, if you take a job that you know requires you to wear a suit, don't complain about wearing a suit.
Right. You know, and again, like, watch what your superiors are doing. I mean, when I did a summer at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oakland, it was just a criminal division, and not every single day were necessarily as formal as other government offices if you knew you weren't going to be in court, but everybody had a suit in their office. Like everybody.
Right. Every lawyer, frankly, should have a suit in their office. I mean, that was one of the pieces of advice we got is like, you know, first day, like summer associates is like, you don't have to wear a suit every day, but you need to be ready to be wearing a suit within like 10 minutes. Meaning, you know, you need a suit hanging on the back of your door, pressed, ready to go with shoes, with jewelry, whatever. Yep. So if someone calls you and says, we need you to be in court in half an hour, you can put that suit on, jump in a taxi, and be there. Yep. Like, that's just a basic expectation of working as a litigator, is like you are ready to go to court at any moment.
It's very true. Casual Friday, doesn't matter. Like, you always have to have a suit either in your car or in your office. So that's...
Yeah, the thing, like, sometimes people will tell you these things and sometimes they won't. And, you know, it's like the first time you get a call that's like, hey, we need you to be in court, and you're like, oh, I'm wearing jeans. It's like, you're doing what?
Right. You know, and I think that, again, finding your professional persona it's not inauthentic. You know, we've heard all sorts of terrible advice given to law students about especially things like dress. I've heard, you know, some career services offices to really tell students to like wipe any personality from their physical appearance that they can.
Right.
And I don't necessarily think it has to be that way. I like Allison's suggestion of it just not being a distraction, but you still have to be yourself. And if you don't feel like yourself, then that's probably not going to lead you to performing at your best because...
Yeah. And I think like we said earlier, like there is this process of sort of negotiating your place in this probably more formal profession. And it's not like at every moment you have to be like, oh, I'm so comfortable. Like I'm as comfortable as I would be at home wearing my sweatpants.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's like, okay, you're a grown up. It's time to put on like grown up clothes and like go out in the world and behave like an adult.
Right.
And maybe that's not as comfortable as like sitting in your pajamas. I'm sorry,
Right.
but that's kind of the way things work. But at the same time, if you feel like, you have to conform and like tamp down every aspect of like the things that you care about and the person that you are, like that can be a sign that like this is really maybe not the right work environment for you to be in.
Yeah, if that's not going to make you happy, then then time to
and obviously back. And the reality is like it's much harder to fit in if you're not the kind of like standard lawyer type. And that's you just have to understand what you're getting into. It's not that there's not a place for you in the profession. It's just that the reality is it will be harder.
Yeah, and you just have to evaluate the pros and cons of all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Just know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
A couple of other places that people tend to go wrong. I mean, number two, I guess after a sense of entitlement, although maybe these are tied together, is being mean to people. Whether it's the underlings in the office. I mean, even thinking of people as underlings or somehow less than you because they didn't go to law school. I think you will quickly find out in most cases the paralegals and the legal secretaries are typically far more competent at this point in your career than you are.
Sure.
I mean, I've even heard of like young lawyers being rude to partners, which really causes you to question what in the world they're thinking.
Terrible idea, by the way. Terrible idea.
Yeah, these are the people who pay you.
Right.
Not that you have to suck up to them, but being openly rude, like for no reason, not a great idea.
No, terrible idea.
Also I think a large part of it comes down to the work. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of law practices, the reality is if you get your work done competently and you get it done on time, you can actually get away with a lot of other things. Yeah. But if your work is not done competently and it is not done on time, you will get away with nothing. Like you will be fired.
Yep. I remember working on a litigation team. It was my first litigation team, and the supervising attorney who I was working for, who's probably like a 6th or a 7th year, sent me a very nice email after the litigation was done. And he said, I really appreciated that whenever I read one of your response motions, because of course I was responding to all of the like crazy wackadoodle motions that have been filed.
Right, and writing like discovery responses.
Right, exactly. Like
crap.
The crazy motions in lemonade and stuff like that. But, he's like, I would read them and I didn't have to edit them. And he's like, that was a huge help to me in this process. And thank you for your attention to detail. And, it was a nice moment of basically being able to say, because I proofread it that extra time, because I, was careful to make sure my citations were right, I actually really did make his job easier. And he appreciated it and would probably put me on his next trial team. And I think it's just something
there's nothing
like that. Yeah. You sometimes forget how important that is.
It is. And I think sometimes people get confused about the idea of like, oh, you're turning in a draft. It's like, no, this is not a draft like you would turn into your teacher in, college to get feedback on. A draft in a legal situation should be something that in theory could be filed with a court. Yeah. You might have comments or questions or whatever, and that's totally fine, but it should not be like just half done. Like the citations should be done and things like that, because you never know. Like someone might just be like, I don't have time to I don't have time to deal with this. We're just going to have to file it.
Exactly. And get stuff done when you say it's going to get done or when they've told you it has to get done. I mean,
right. If you're not going to, that needs to be like an immediate heads up.
Yes.
You cannot wait until the last minute and be like, oh, by the way, this is not happening.
Yeah, no.
I think
that's for everything. Like, if life happens and you have a family tragedy, or, once my cat got super sick when my husband was out of town and I was working at the farm, and luckily we didn't have anything super, super time sensitive, but I had to BlackBerry the supervising attorney and be like, I'm at the vet with my cat and I'm home alone. Like, this is like, I'm sorry, I will send you updates, but I'm probably going to miss this meeting. But I did it the minute I realized I couldn't be there. And that's different than emailing during the meeting.
Or just not showing up to it. And then letting them wonder, like, well, wait, why wasn't Lee there? Now it's my problem to track her down and figure out why she wasn't there. That is not professional.
Right. And so just open communication in a professional way. I think for me, one area where all of us can get a bit sloppy is the professionalism of email communications as well.
Oh, yes.
Because I think now that we all text so much, the lines between a text and an email and even a voicemail and things like that are all getting very blurred. But at work, I think you really want to check yourself with emails, proofread them before you send them, especially to somebody higher up than you. Remember that those emails are now permanent records of things and are searchable.
Yeah, after you do like one set of, reviewing discovery document review, you will never look at email the same way again.
No, I mean...
Because you're like, oh my God, someone might be reading this like 5 or 10 years from now. And like, what am I saying?
Yes, especially on...
And it's amazing what people say in emails.
It is amazing what people say. And you just want to remember that, somebody is just reading it. And I think sometimes you can come off as being very curt when maybe you're not trying to be very curt just based on the email. And so it's just good to be thoughtful and find your voice with email too. I actually have a friend that I worked with at a nonprofit. And her family, or she's from Russia, and she is very dry. And she always said that it annoyed her that all of my emails would start with, "I hope you're doing well." It was like, "Hi, so and so. I hope you're doing well." Like blah blah blah. She's like, "Just get to the point. I don't have time to read your welcome." It's like,
yeah,
okay.
I mean, I think it's just you just have to think about it.
Yeah, but you have to think about it, and of course, tailor the message to the person. Once she told you
that, if someone tells you that, you're like, great, you'll get the curt version.
Exactly.
It doesn't take that much longer to put someone's name in, and it just is a little bit more friendly.
Exactly.
I mean, I can't even tell you the number of conversations I've had with people in legal practice about what the best sign off is. I know it's like, is best too passive aggressive if I'm writing to opposing counsel, but like these things actually do have an impact. Like, we're lawyers, like the words that you choose, they have meaning.
And I think it's great to pay attention to how the other attorneys are signing emails. And, you can always look around and see what other people are doing and then copy them. So you're
it's like, this is part of finding your own voice, is you look for people who you admire as attorneys, and not that you have to mimic them, but like, what is it that you admire about them? And you can completely take bits and pieces and turn it into your own professional persona.
For sure. One though, side note, especially you will learn this the first time you do a document review, please do not talk about personal things over work email.
Yeah.
It's a terrible, terrible idea.
And also double, triple check, maybe even using technology, who you're sending these emails to.
Yes.
I mean, this happens with everyone in legal practice. I mean, I have, a story from a managing partner who accidentally CC'd a judge about what an idiot she was. And you want to talk about someone who had to call chambers and grovel. This was a managing partner.
Yeah.
He just, it doesn't matter. You do not do that.
Yeah, exactly. But there was someone I worked with once who told me that her firm had ended up becoming part of litigation, and so her computer and emails were part of discovery, and their own team of document review folks was going through the first pass, and she had gone through a very messy divorce while working there, and all of her emails with her ex-husband were on her work computer, and she's like, the associates of the firm read all of the emails with
they have to. I mean,
they have to.
God.
And that's just not necessary. You just keep that on your Gmail, then keep it out of the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, with everyone having their own devices, there's literally no excuse for you to be using your work email for public purposes.
People still do. So please just don't do that. Just don't do it.
Keep it separate.
Keep it separate. You will be thankful for it. But definitely just remember that email is forever, and that's the way it is. Okay.
All right. Well, we're unfortunately getting about out of time. Let's sort of summarize. Like, what do you need to do really to be perceived as a professional? So, I mean, it's all the things we've really talked about above, right? We don't need to belabor the point, but show up on time, be prepared. This is your word. Your reputation as a lawyer is your word. If you're someone who's not showing up to things, who's not getting things done, that doesn't look good.
No, it does not. And it can be little things, but this is one thing that you must do really when you work anywhere is every time you walk into a meeting with a supervisor, you better be there with a notebook and a pen to take notes about what they're going to tell you.
Absolutely, because they're not going to want to tell it to you again.
No, and they're not going to send you an email summarizing what happened in the meeting.
No, in fact, it's nice if you send them an email summarizing what happened in the meeting, because that makes their life easier.
It does. Yes.
Even people who work for us occasionally, we'll have a meeting and 10 minutes later I get an email being like, okay, so here's what we talked about. Here are the action items. Here's what you're doing and here's what I'm doing. And I'm like, perfect.
Yes, great. We're all on the same page. Exactly. Yeah. And be polite to everyone, both the people above you on the totem pole and the people below you. But nothing bad comes from being a nice person.
And you never know when you're going to need to call in a favor. It's like if you've been the person who's always friendly to the people who do the word processing and suddenly you have a rush document and they're going to have to drop someone else's work to get it done.
Yeah.
Who do you think they're going to help? Someone who's always been friendly and occasionally brought them chocolate, or someone who's been a jerk to them or never talked to them.
For sure. Oh, go ahead.
No, I don't think it's ever going to be, I don't think they're going to, pull any favors for the person that hasn't made an effort.
No, and the legal community can be fairly small. I mean, even within San Francisco, everybody talks about what a small town it is. You run into the same people professionally over and over again. And
your reputation follows.
It's true. And when I worked in Hollywood, when I was in college, all of the assistants would keep lists of people who had wronged them when they were assistants, because it was very much a climb the ladder type thing. Everybody was assistant at some point, and then you were, assistant producer or whatever. But they kept these lists.
Oh yeah, people remember.
And they would look for an opportunity to hand back some of the attitude that they got, many, many moons before. And so you just want to remember that it is, it only behooves you to try not to be mean to people at every occasion. Just try and be nice.
It can come back to bite you. I mean, I personally have either gotten people jobs or not gotten people jobs because of the way that they behaved in the past.
Yeah, exactly.
And everyone does it.
Yep, everybody does it. And as we said, get your work done and on time. Not to be crazy and kill yourself, pulling all-nighters all the time, but if you're supposed to deliver something, either deliver it on time, or as soon as you know that something's not going right, talk to your supervisor. Don't keep them in the dark.
No, and I think the point here is, don't overextend yourself either. And sometimes this is probably a different podcast, but, this can require learning how to say no. And that's an important skill in a professional environment, particularly one that's as hours demanding as the legal profession is. You have to be able to tactfully tell someone that you just don't have the bandwidth to work on their project.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, any other final stories that you want to share? Warning stories?
Well, there's one, I've got a couple, I'll make them brief. There's one the second year who was assigned to make copies and didn't make them properly and almost got fired by the partner on the spot. I think the exact quote was, "I'm paying you $200,000 a year and you can't be bothered to make 12 copies."
Ouch.
Who else do you think is going to do this? It's Sunday afternoon. Seriously, make the freaking copies and get it right. Then there's another one a friend of mine told me about recently, about this horrible associate they work with, who there was some situation where they needed to take some emergency depositions. Everybody's busy. Literally every person on the team was assigned to drop everything, go take this deposition on a weekend. And literally the lowest person on the totem pole sent an email to the entire team saying he would only change his personal schedule to take a deposition on a Sunday if the managing partner of the firm personally asked him in person to do it.
Wow.
At which point I was like, is that person still working with you? Because if I was the partner, I would literally fire them in a response email.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I mean, totally unbelievable. Gosh. You're just like, what are you thinking? So don't be that person.
No. I guess the last thing I would say for people listening is, what if you're just scratching your head at the end of this podcast and being like, I've never worked in a professional environment. I didn't grow up in a family where people worked in these kinds of environments. Members of my family worked in these kinds of environments. how do you start to navigate? Where do people go to ask for help, or who are the people that you should talk to kind of feel out what the rules are in your given workplace?
Well, I mean, I think this is a point where, if somebody's making a big law salary, I would say you actually probably should hire a career coach. Get that external perspective. You don't necessarily want to be talking. You can't trust people at your firm, frankly, or your work environment necessarily. I mean, maybe you can. But, you can talk to people. I mean, we get it. It's hard because you're a lawyer. There's confidentiality issues. I could say you could talk to people like other lawyers that who are sort of outside of the process. I mean, I would be really careful about sort of, kvetching with people at your firm or at your other, legal organization about this, because I think it just, things get back to people.
Do you think if you're in law school, maybe career services is a place you can go to at least talk about them to?
I mean, maybe, depending if you trust them.
Yeah. I know in interviewing for jobs, sometimes they would connect us with people who'd worked at the firm before, so we could ask some questions about kind of how the office worked.
Yeah. I think you just have to be judicious about who you're talking to and who you're taking advice from.
But I
think it's a hard question.
It is a hard question, but looking for mentors, looking for people you can trust, but being thoughtful about choosing those people wisely.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these can be kind of backstabbing environments, a lot of them. I mean, it's the reality, right?
I know. And on that note, we are out of time.
With that, we're out of time.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything in the future. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.